In the sweltering heart of Colombia, beneath the golden sun that danced over sugarcane fields and through the chaotic streets of Cali, something unspeakable was happening. It was the 1960s, a time of music, revolution, and transformation for much of the world. But hidden behind the facade of progress was a darker truth festering in the shadows of the Mangones neighborhood. Children began to vanish. Not once, not twice, dozens. Poor barefoot boys no older than 13, with dirt on their faces and dreams in their eyes, disappeared from alleyways, parks, and street corners. Some would later be found, lifeless, mutilated, and discarded like yesterday's garbage. Others simply vanished forever, their names known only to their grieving mothers. But this was not the work of a single tragic accident or a random act of violence. These were patterns, rituals, killings. Locals whispered of a monster, a ghost, a devil in human form who hunted the city's most vulnerable, then melted back into the jungle of poverty and neglect. The newspapers barely noticed. The police did less, and the rest of the country turned away. They called him El Monstruo de los Mangones, the monster of the Mangones. You've heard of the Zodiac. You know about Dahmer. But chances are you've never heard this story. Tonight, we bring it back from the dead. To understand how a serial killer could haunt a city for years without being stopped, or even noticed, you first have to understand Cali, Colombia, in the 1960s and 70s. On the surface, it was a city on the rise. Skyscrapers were climbing, highways expanding, factories booming. Cali was growing faster than it could handle. Behind the glossy brochures for tourists and investors, a much grimmer reality festered in its shadow. The rapid urbanization brought people from rural areas flooding into the city, farmers, displaced families, and those hoping for a better life. But Cali wasn't ready for them. Shantytowns like El Calvario, Tirán, Colorado, and Los Mangones emerged almost overnight, illegal settlements built on the margins of society, both geographically and economically. Electricity was rare. Clean water even rarer. These were places where hope flickered, but danger burned steadily. Law enforcement didn't venture into these neighborhoods unless forced. Corruption was rampant, and so was apathy. To the authorities, these weren't citizens, they were statistics. Disposable. And the children. They were the most invisible of all. Many weren't even registered at birth. They didn't attend school. They worked. They begged. They roamed. If they disappeared, there was no paperwork. No alert. No search party. The newspapers didn't print their names. The television didn't broadcast their photos. Their disappearances were whispered about in local markets, scrawled on handmade posters, or cried over in dark, crowded rooms. But officially, they barely existed. And it was in this silence, a silence created by poverty, inequality, and neglect, that the monster thrived. He didn't need to be clever. He didn't need to be fast. He simply needed to exist in a system that didn't care who lived or died in the Mangones. This wasn't just a failure of police work. It was a failure of society itself. Because when the most vulnerable vanish and no one even blinks, monsters are not only possible, they are inevitable. The next time a child went missing in Cali, no alarm bells rang. No Amber Alerts. Just silence and the slow realization that he would not be the last. The first known disappearance was barely a whisper. In 1969, a 7-year-old boy named Alvaro Medina didn't come home from the market. His mother, a domestic worker, went to the police the next morning. They shrugged. He probably ran away, they said. Kids do that all the time in Mangones. No posters were printed. No officers were dispatched. No one looked. 3 weeks later, another boy disappeared. Santiago Rivera, age 9, then Andres Lozano. 10, all from the same cluster of neighborhoods on the city's edge, Los Mangones, El Velado, Charco Azul. They vanished without a sound. At first, families blamed the city. Some thought it was drug gangs recruiting young runners. Others whispered about organ traffickers. But something didn't add up. Then the bodies started turning up, buried in shallow graves, dumped in irrigation canals, covered with sugarcane leaves. The first few were too decomposed to identify immediately. But the forensic teams, limited, underfunded, often drunk on duty, noticed a common pattern. Signs of sexual abuse, mutilation, postmortem injuries, limbs arranged in strange positions, clothing missing or returned, folded neatly on top of the body. The public didn't hear these details. Most newspapers buried the stories, if they printed them at all. One short article from El País in March 1970 mentioned troublemakers found dead in the sugar fields. No follow-up. No outrage. But the people in the neighborhoods were keeping count. By 1971, at least a dozen boys had gone missing. Their ages ranged from 6 to 13. They were usually last seen walking alone, carrying water jugs, selling lottery tickets, delivering food. Each one vanished in broad daylight, sometimes just minutes after speaking to a neighbor or waving goodbye to a sibling. A survivor eventually came forward. Julian Torres, age 11, said a man in a white van offered him money to help carry boxes near the train station. When they arrived at a sugar field, the man pulled a knife. Julian ran, barefoot, bleeding, and didn't stop until he reached the road. Police didn't believe him. Too much television, they said. But the story spread. In 1972, the killings escalated. A cluster of 5 disappearances occurred within 2 months. One after another: Felipe, Raul, Jorge, Mateo, Daniel. The bodies of 4 were found within a mile of each other, near the edge of Mangones. The 5th was never found. That year, whispers turned to screams. Women marched in protest. Handwritten placards lined fences. Donde están nuestros hijos? Cuantos más tienen que morir? But police still offered no leads. No suspect sketches. No warnings. Patterns emerged. All victims were male. All from low-income areas. All disappeared during the day. Most were found within 3 to 5 days, dumped, not hidden. Some bore symbols carved into their skin, meaningless to police, terrifying to families. By late 1973, locals were calling the killer El Loco de los Mangones, the madman of Mangones. The name evolved into El Monstruo. Rumors exploded. Some believed he was a foreigner. Others said he was protected by police. Some swore they saw him walking calmly through the fields at night, as if the city itself had surrendered. One anonymous resident, quoted in a buried 1974 article, said, "We know the monster is real, he walks among us, but no one with power cares because our children don't matter." By 1974, the death toll had passed 25 known victims. Experts today estimate the real number may be over 40, possibly higher, because many children were never reported missing in the first place. And still no arrests. No convictions. No justice. This wasn't a killing spree. This was a campaign, slow, deliberate, targeted. And it was allowed to happen, year after year, because the victims were poor. Because they were forgotten. Because they were invisible. This was not the story of one bad man. It was the story of a system that let him hunt. And soon the monster's name would be whispered not just in Mangones, but across all of Cali. The sugarcane fields surrounding Los Mangones were dense, tall, and rustling with secrets. To the city's poor, they were a place to play, to hide, or to cut cane for pennies. But by the early 1970s, these fields became something else entirely. They became graveyards. It began with dogs. Farmers near the eastern outskirts of Cali reported their dogs dragging bones back from the fields. One thought it was animal remains. Another recognized the tattered scraps of a school uniform. When a group of children stumbled on a half-buried body in April 1971, what they found would haunt the neighborhood forever. The corpse was that of a boy no older than 10. His wrists were bound with thin wire, now rusted. His eyes were missing. His shirt had been removed and folded beside him, placed with almost ceremonial precision. This was not an accident. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was murder. And it was methodical. The body was so decomposed that identification took weeks, relying on a slum priest who recognized the boy by a homemade bracelet he'd blessed at church. More were found in the following months. 1 behind a crumbling shack. 2 in a dry irrigation ditch. Another hanging from a tree by his belt, hands tied behind his back. Every discovery sent shockwaves through the local barrios, but still barely a ripple across the rest of Cali. The crime scenes were eerily consistent. Victims were all male, aged 6 to 13. Most bore signs of sexual violence. Mutilation was common, genitals removed, hands broken, eyes gouged. Several were posed or deliberately arranged. Yet forensic tools in 1970s Colombia were primitive at best. No DNA testing. No criminal profiling. No centralized missing persons database. Victims were often buried in mass graves or returned to families without full autopsies. Many officers refused to even enter Mangones at night. One retired officer later admitted, "We didn't have the tools, we didn't have the orders, and if I'm honest, we didn't have the will." Locals, however, were not so numb. They began building maps, crude ones, hand-drawn and passed from neighbor to neighbor, marking the places where bodies had been found. A chilling pattern emerged. All discoveries were within a 2.5-kilometer radius, many near narrow access paths or abandoned shacks. Despite this, police insisted there was no link between the deaths. They blamed the jungle, the heat, the chaotic nature of poor communities. But the people knew. The mothers knew. The children, walking in pairs now, holding hands tightly, knew. One boy, only 8 years old, told his sister, "If the man with the missing teeth comes near me, I'll run into the cane and never come back." The fear was real, tangible, and worse, it was ignored. These weren't random tragedies. This was a pattern of terror, allowed to grow, body by body, scream by scream. The mystery had become horror, and the horror had become routine. Soon, even the silence began to scream. In most cities, the discovery of even one murdered child would trigger alarms. Press conferences, task forces, media frenzies. But in Cali in the 1970s, when children from Mangones and other slums began to vanish, and then turn up mutilated in cane fields, the reaction from police was almost surreal in its indifference. There were no manhunts, no psychological profilers, no patrol increases, just silence. Many officers flatly dismissed the idea of a serial killer. One lieutenant, when asked by a local journalist in 1973, responded, "There's no proof these cases are connected. These neighborhoods have their own problems, drugs, gangs, vagrants. These children are probably mixed up in that." In private, the police referred to the victims as throwaway kids. Children without papers, without school records, without importance. Missing person reports were rarely filed. And when they were lost, ignored, or simply tossed into filing cabinets never to be seen again. In some precincts, desperate families had to bribe officers just to get them to take a statement. One woman, Esperanza Ramirez, walked barefoot for 6 hours from her home in Charco Azul to police headquarters after her 10-year-old son Tomás vanished. She brought with her a photograph, his baptism certificate, and a list of friends he last played with. They told her to come back with a male relative. She never saw her son again. Another mother, Clemencia Torres, lost 2 sons in 2 years. Both found dead. Both cases closed with no autopsy. When she protested outside City Hall, she was arrested for disturbing the peace. These stories were not isolated. They were systemic. Behind the apathy was something more insidious: corruption. Cali in the early 70s was rife with political distraction. The city was battling cartel influence, managing mass migration, and suppressing student protests. High-ranking officials were more concerned with their ties to Bogotá and business elites than with dead children in sugar fields. Some even profited from the chaos. There were whispers, never confirmed, but never denied, that certain officers were paid to keep quiet, or that the killer may have been protected by someone in uniform. After all, how else could he evade capture for so long? There were moments of hope, brief flickers that justice might be possible. In 1974, a young investigator named Carlos Mendieta began looking into the deaths unofficially. He compiled a list of 17 connected cases. He noted the geographic clustering, the commonalities in wounds, the victim profiles. Then, just as he prepared to go public, he was reassigned, transferred without explanation to a traffic division in a neighboring city. His files disappeared. To the families, the message was clear: you are alone. And yet, they did not give up. Mothers formed vigil groups. Fathers patrolled the fields with sticks and whistles. Some carried photos door to door, asking strangers if they'd seen anything at all. A few sympathetic priests helped organize marches. One even offered his church as a space to display photographs of the missing, dozens of faces staring out from under a hand-painted sign that read, "Nuestros hijos también merecen justicia," our children also deserve justice. But the authorities never came. The press barely looked. And the monster of the Mangones kept killing. This wasn't just a failure of police work. It was a failure of humanity. A city that turned its back. A government that closed its eyes. A system that decided who mattered and who didn't. And for the families of Mangones, that silence was the loudest answer of all. In late 1974, after years of silence and growing outrage, police finally made an arrest. The man's name was Pedro Pablo Ramirez, a 38-year-old maintenance worker with no criminal record, living in a cramped room just blocks from where several of the bodies had been found. He was quiet, unremarkable, and largely invisible to his neighbors. According to police, Ramirez was caught after attempting to lure a young boy with candy behind a bus terminal near Mangones. A local vendor witnessed the exchange, intervened, and called the authorities. When officers searched his room, they claimed to find children's clothing, photographs, and crude drawings. No forensic evidence was ever publicly disclosed. No blood, no DNA. Of course, DNA testing wasn't available in Colombia at the time. Ramirez was taken into custody. Within hours, newspapers called him the Butcher of Mangones. Police hailed it as the end of a nightmare. One headline read, "Monster caught, justice for Cali's children." But almost immediately, doubts began to surface. Ramirez didn't confess. In fact, during every interrogation, he maintained his innocence. He insisted the clothes were from a cousin's children. The drawings, he said, were copied from magazines. He admitted to being mentally ill. He reportedly heard voices and suffered from paranoid delusions, but denied ever harming a child. No trial transcript has ever been released. Some say he was declared unfit for trial and sent to a psychiatric facility. Others claim he died in prison, beaten by other inmates before he ever saw a judge. To this day, there is no official verdict recorded in any public Colombian archive. And for the families of the victims, the arrest didn't bring closure. Many believed that Ramirez was a scapegoat, a convenient face to silence the protests and close the case. His arrest came just days before a local election. Some whispered that his story was rushed, staged, even fabricated to calm the public. Even more chilling were the disappearances that continued afterward, fewer, quieter, but still real. At least 4 boys were reported missing in the Mangones area in 1975 and 76. 2 were found. The rest were never seen again. Was Pedro Ramirez the monster? Or just another victim, of fear, of desperation, of a system that needed someone to blame? Others believe the monster was never just one man. That it was a ring, a network of predators who shared secrets and silence. Some say the killer worked with corrupt police. Some think he moved to another city, started over, and never stopped. The truth? We may never know. The story had a suspect, but not an ending. For decades, the name El Monstruo de los Mangones has rarely appeared in books, headlines, or documentaries. There are no true crime podcasts dedicated to him. No Wikipedia page. No Netflix special. In fact, outside of Colombia, almost no one knows this story. How does a serial killer, who may have murdered over 40 children, vanish from public memory? The answer is as haunting as the crimes themselves. It begins with poverty. The children he killed came from the poorest neighborhoods in Cali. Many weren't even registered at birth. They had no IDs, no school records. Some didn't even have last names written on paper. When they vanished, there was no national alert system. No coordinated effort to find them. They were buried quietly, often in shared graves, their names misspelled, if recorded at all. And in the world of media, those are not the kinds of victims that make headlines. They weren't white. They weren't middle class. They didn't come from respectable families. They didn't sell newspapers. And so they were ignored. In the global north, cases like John Bennett Ramsey, Madeleine McCann, or the victims of Jeffrey Dahmer become cultural flashpoints, investigated, debated, remembered. But in the global south, where entire communities live in the margins, tragedy is often treated as background noise. When children disappear in poor countries, the world shrugs. In the case of the Mangones murders, even Colombia itself seemed eager to forget. Authorities buried the files, literally and metaphorically. The case was closed, publicly at least, once Pedro Ramirez was arrested. No further investigation was pursued. No monument was built. No national day of mourning. Just silence. But the families never forgot. Many of the mothers who lost their sons never moved away. They stayed building tiny shrines in their homes, photos taped to cracked walls, rosaries draped over frames, candles burning endlessly. Esperanza Ramirez, the mother who walked for hours to file her missing person report, died in 2001. She never found out what happened to her son Tomás. Clemencia Torres, who lost 2 sons, still visits the same sugarcane field every year on the anniversary of their disappearances. She told a journalist in 2015, "I don't need justice anymore. I just want someone to remember their names." But few do. That is the final cruelty of the monster of the Mangones. He didn't just take lives, he erased them. And the world let him. In true crime, we often remember the killers. We dissect their psychology. We give them nicknames. We turn them into myth. But the Mangones case reminds us what happens when the victims aren't rich enough, white enough, visible enough. They are forgotten. Just like the monster wanted. But today, we say their names. We tell their story. And we refuse to let the silence win. Who was the monster of the Mangones? Maybe it was Pedro Pablo Ramirez, the man police arrested and blamed. Maybe it was someone else, a face that never made the front page, a name that never left the files. Or maybe it was more than one person. A network. A hidden evil that thrived not just on cruelty, but on society's refusal to see. In the end, the identity of the killer may not be the most important truth. What matters is what his story reveals, about how we value some lives more than others, how we ignore the most vulnerable, and how silence can be just as deadly as any weapon. Dozens of children, poor, nameless, forgotten, were taken from their families. And not because the killer was especially cunning or brilliant, but because no one in power cared enough to stop him. There were no manhunts, no urgency, no justice, just silence. The kind of silence that grows over years and decades until it's not just a cover-up, it's erasure. Today we remember those children, not just as victims, but as human beings. As sons and brothers. As kids who laughed, played, dreamed, and deserved better. And we ask ourselves the question that lingers long after the camera fades. Why do some stories survive and others disappear? Why do we know the names of some killers, but not the names of the children they destroyed? The monster of the Mangones wasn't just a man. He was a consequence. A symptom of a world that looks away when the poor suffer. A society that only listens when the victim is someone who matters. Some monsters aren't legends. They aren't shadows on the wall. They don't hide in haunted houses or creep through fairy tales. Some monsters live just down the street. And the most terrifying thing of all is how easy they are to ignore.